For the first video of the social psychology section, I want to focus on a particularly important experiment done in the 50s by a man named Solomon Asch. And what he did was a study on conformity. First, he brought in a group of subjects. Only one of the subjects was actually an experimental subject. The others were Confederates of Solomon Asch. And then he showed them a stimulus and asked them to judge from a card they had whether the stimulus was the first, second, or third one. Now, the stimulus choice was obvious, but as the Confederates started giving their answers, going around the table, and our subject was last, they gave the wrong answer. And the subject, sitting there looking at their cards, says, wow, that's not what I'm seeing, that's not what I'm seeing. But what happened was when they got to that subject, in a very high proportion of the time, the subjects said the wrong answer, the answer that conflicted with their own perceptions. Let me show you first the stimuli that were involved.
Here they are. Notice that this is discussed in the text on page 474. At the top, you see the stimulus, which is obviously answer B. And so very few of us would answer anything other than B. But in this experiment, many of us did not. We followed the group which, let's say, answered C instead of B, even though it conflicted with our perceptions.
What do we make out of this result? Well, one of the things we make out of it is that people are vulnerable to the thoughts of others as expressed. Now, this may come from our group evolutionary history that we discussed back in the brains chapter and in the discussions we had about consciousness. If you're alone and you see something, then it's what it is. But suppose you're surrounded by a bunch of other people. Suppose you're camping and you see something run by in the woods and everybody else thinks it's a rabbit, but you think it might be a wolf. Well, perhaps it's better not to make defensive preparations because maybe they're right. It is a rabbit. So there are opportunities for groupthink to improve individual think, particularly under circumstances where there might be perceptual challenges. Maybe someone had a better view. Of course, there's also the opposite. The groupthink can get us in trouble and make us come to a conclusion that is wrong. Plenty of examples where the groupthink can be wrong. One is discussed in the beginning of the chapter, where an individual after 9/11 was assumed to have a high probability of being a terrorist and taken off a plane, even though his background, although physically he resembled people who wore beards and turbans, was of the Sikh orientation, where that's not at all an Arab culture. We just didn't know. Another example, which is discussed earlier in the text book, is the Milgram experiments, where that poor subject was coerced into shocking another subject, or at least they thought they were doing so, to the point where the person was screaming in the other room. And that experiment led to a whole series of changes in psychology where you can't deceive people, at least not to that level, and not without telling them afterwards what you've done, and your whole experiment is required to be approved by a committee before you can do anything. So there are negative sides to this. But my point here really is that this ties back to our discussions of consciousness. There is a way in which the group can get into our heads, possibly at the mammalian brain level, to use an earlier concept, and let that become a justification for our conscious actions, even if it conflicts with our perceptions. The take-home message is that groups are very important and possibly influence us in ways of which we are not aware through unconscious decision-making, but can have powerful effects on our behavior.